Nearly 1 million deaths in the United States as two new COVID-19 subvariants emerge. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. The United States is nearing 1 million COVID-19 deaths, just over 2 years since the pandemic began. Many are concerned as the uptick in cases and hospitalizations continue around the world. Two new subvariants have emerged in South Africa and are spreading to other countries, including the United States. So, are we bracing for another wave? To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Tempe, Arizona, is Dr. Joshua LaBaer. He is the Executive Director of the Biodesign Institute at Arizona State University. And from Alexandria in Virginia, Dr. Kate Tulenko is the founder and CEO of Corvus Health. Welcome to both of you to the show. And Kate, let me start with you. So we are seeing this new surge of infections in South Africa, and they're being driven and fueled by these two new subvariants. Now, if we look at the situation in South Africa right now, just over 30% of the South African population is fully vaccinated, and in some instances, of course, some people have received the boosters as well. But the country also has a very high percentage of people who are immune. That's up to 90%. What can you tell us about these subvariants?
Well, the subvariants of Omicron are more infectious than the Delta and the other variants we've seen in the past, but they're more mild, thank goodness. But I think we're going to see a wave similar to this in the U.S. We already have these two subvariants in the U.S., although they're not the most common variant right now. And, you know, the virus is starting to evolve differently because it's under different pressures. When we first were getting the first set of subvariants, it was really an immune naive population. But now when you look at South Africa, as you mentioned, 90% or more of the population either has had COVID or has had the vaccine. So the virus is under different pressures. So as mutations occur, different types of mutations are going to be more successful. And, you know, I think that we're going to really have to change our language around COVID vaccination from being fully vaccinated to being up to date. You know, the idea that you have to constantly get boosters, you know, once a year or perhaps even more.
Now, Kate, when you say that the impact of these subvariants is milder, does that mean that people who are vaccinated will not end up in hospital or even die?
Well, people who are vaccinated will have milder disease, but of course you have older people, people with weakened immune systems due to medicines they're taking or other conditions they might have. And even if they are, you know, fully up to date, they can get very sick, can be hospitalized and even die. So I don't think we're over with the excess deaths. And as you mentioned, the U.S. is soon going to reach 1 million COVID deaths. So close to 1 in 300 Americans will have died of COVID over the last 2 years.
Joshua LaBaer, great to have you with us. Welcome to the show. Dr. Tulio Oliveira, he's the director of one of South Africa's major research facilities. He's been following, of course, the two subvariants very closely, and he said, and I'm quoting here, "What we are seeing now, or at least the first signs, is not completely new variants emerging, but current variants are starting to create lineages of themselves." What does that mean? How is this different, and how will this impact the global effort to control the pandemic?
Right. Well, you know, when we shifted from the Delta variant to the Omicron variant was like a completely different lineage from Delta. It was not from Delta. It was just something completely different. It had a whole slew of different new mutations. But what we're seeing now with this BA4 and the BA5 subvariants is really more kind of evolving from the existing Omicron variant. So it's down the same tree, if you will, that Omicron is on. They're extremely infectious. We're up at the range of measles now, so very easy to transmit. And as you mentioned earlier, they can even infect people who already have had this virus before. So they've already had the coronavirus, but they can still get infected by this variant. So I think that's kind of what we're looking at the time being. If that's the case, as we've already mentioned today, we're hopeful that that means that for the most part, people who've been vaccinated won't have severe disease. Although, as was already mentioned, people who have other illnesses could still get very ill.
So the vaccines, Joshua, are still effective even against these variants, subvariants?
They appear to be, yeah. For the most part, even in the States, while we're seeing a rise in cases here, and we are seeing some rise in hospitalizations, it's not anywhere near what we saw earlier on or what we saw with Delta, where there was just, the hospitals were overrun, ICUs were overrun. We're not seeing that, at least right now.
Joshua, right at the beginning of this pandemic, when we saw the first outbreak, we had people ending up in hospital having difficulty breathing. Many of them actually were intubated, and then a lot of them died in their hospital beds there. Are we seeing any of that anymore?
Certainly not right now, as far as I know in the United States. We're not seeing that level of infection where people are heading to the intensive care units to get oxygen. That's not to say that around the world, in some places, that isn't happening. I think there are places where that's happening. But for now, at least, this Omicron variant seems to have less of that respiratory component to it, less of the demand for oxygen. There's a bit more of a GI symptomology that we sometimes see now. So the virus is changing a little bit.
Kate, the pharmaceutical company Moderna, they are looking for approval from the Food and Drug Administration for a vaccine that they can administer to children under 5 years old. And as, of course, we are aware, this is a group that has not been protected from the virus so far. If approval is granted, how does that change the fight against COVID and managing the pandemic?
We know that children in that age group of 6 months to 5 years haven't been a group that has had a lot of mortality or even a lot of hospitalization, but there certainly has been some. They're more involved in transmitting COVID to parents, grandparents, other relatives. And so being able to vaccinate them, especially if they can be vaccinated before school restarts in August and September, will make a big difference. Right now, the kids that are about 6 to 11 are only about 30% vaccinated in the U.S. So I think that we can expect to see 30% or less vaccination in the 6 months to 5 year group.
So, Kate, the situation right now is if a child, say under 5 years old, is infected with the virus, that child can then pass that on to his or her parents or grandparents, right?
Yes, correct. And they are much more likely as older people to have conditions that would make them at risk for severe illness or death.
Joshua, we're also hearing of something else, which is a phenomenon called S-gene target failure. This is where PCR tests, that's the more advanced test, fails to detect the variant. What can you tell us about that?
Well, you certainly, some of the probes that are used in these qPCR assays overlap with mutations in the new variants. And so if your qPCR test is designed for that particular region, you might not pick it up. Many of the tests today anticipate this, and so they often have multiple probes to the S gene, so that if one fails, another one will pick it up. And so we're hopeful that people will do that. And of course, none of this applies to the antigen tests, although in general, the antigen tests are not as good as the qPCR tests.
Now, the subvariants that we've been talking about, could they spark a new surge in the United States?
I certainly think they could, yeah. I think, as Kate mentioned earlier, there are certainly chances that these could start to take over just because they are so infectious, they're so contagious. In Arizona, where I live right now, the trend is the other direction. Things are continuing to go down for us. But in Arizona, we often are late at the end of all this, and it comes back to get us later on. So, I think we should all anticipate this in New York and the East Coast. We're starting to see rising cases and also rising hospitalizations. So I think we have to keep an eye out for that.
But would you say, Joshua, relatively speaking, that the country is well protected? I mean, if we look at some of the numbers in the United States on vaccinations, 66% of the U.S. population is fully vaccinated, and 45% are boosted. So
yes, and even higher numbers among the older population are vaccinated. So there's a trend towards, as people get older, they're being appropriately more concerned and getting more vaccinated. So we are more protected, and of course we've had a lot of infections here. Omicron passed through almost all the states and infected many people there too. So hopefully that will protect us and keep us out of the hospital for the most part. But there will always be those people who have other illnesses or just age alone that will end up in the hospital and suffer the consequences.
Kate, as Joshua says, we would be protected, but what do you make of the fact that in many instances we've removed all the restrictions and measures that we put in place over the past 2 years?
People will have to use their own personal judgment, look at their own risk, look at the risk of their loved ones and the people they're around, and act accordingly. For example, my husband has diabetes, which makes him high risk. So I will always wear a mask, when I'm indoors in public places, while COVID is around. But other people will make different decisions. It'll be interesting to see in the next 3 weeks, the World Health Organization is going to hold their first in-person World Health Assembly in 3 years. The World Health Assembly is a decision body of the WHO, and we're going to look at them continue to push more on COVID, on getting people vaccinated now, on getting more measures, but also looking at the potential next pandemic and seeing what WHO and governments around the world can do to be more prepared for the next pandemic, particularly in regards to misinformation that we've seen cause so much problems in this pandemic.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to both of you for being with us.
I very much appreciate it. Take care, everyone. Stay safe.
You're welcome. Thank you for being with us. Coming up, we'll examine how US billionaires became richer during the pandemic. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.
The nature of business is to bring value. Business activities in Europe, Asia, and the US reach consumers globally. Trade, manufacturing, energy, high-tech, real estate, consumption. We give an expanded view on global business and how it covers, influences, or relates to the whole world. Global business, only on CGTN. To know about China. China 24, only on CGTN.
Making sense of the overwhelming wave of information means cutting through the noise to shine a light on the heart of the story and making room for new perspectives. True understanding means the ability to see events from more than one side. I'm Liu Xin, and this is The Point.
Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing how the pandemic exacerbated wealth disparity in the United States. During the first 2 years of the pandemic, the ultra-rich in the US increased their wealth by $1.7 trillion, while many Americans lost jobs and struggled to make ends meet. This $1.7 trillion would be enough to wipe out most of the student loan debt or cover the cost of US President Biden's Build Back Better social spending and infrastructure bill. To discuss this and more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from New York, Anthony Chan is the former chief economist at JP Morgan Chase & Company. From Miami, Florida, we're joined by Atiba Madian. He is the founder and president of Party Politics US, a data collection firm, and the author of the political thriller Saving Grace. And from San Diego, California, Josh Enomoto is a contributor for Investor Place and barchart.com. Welcome to all of you. Anthony Chan, let me start with you. The pandemic, of course, has been very good for the mega rich in the United States. As I said, they were able to accumulate $1.7 trillion, while a lot of Americans struggle to make ends meet. But what is it about the pandemic and the restrictions that we were placed under and the behavior that changed so much that made it so lucrative for rich people?
Well, what made it very lucrative is that there was a lot of liquidity put into the overall economy by the Federal Reserve, for example, with quantitative easing. They put in trillions of dollars in the expanding of the balance sheet, almost a $5 trillion increase in the balance sheet. We saw the money supply surging, and the expression of all that liquidity came to fruition by looking at equity prices. Equity prices, of course, hit a low in 2020, and then, of course, since then, even with the recent correction in the S&P 500, we're up almost more than 85% on the S&P 500, and we know that the average person is depending on wages, and even though wages have increased, they have not outpaced inflation, and they certainly haven't risen as much as asset prices, which is primarily the currency of these wealthy individuals, and that is what has allowed them to increase their wealth over most of the rest of the population.
And during those 2 years, during the lockdown especially, Anthony, did we see consumption increase as well?
Well, there was a restriction on consumer spending because even though we allowed the government to basically provide stimulus checks, consumers could not really spend it. So yes, they did accumulate extra savings, and so savings today are still much, much higher than they were before the pandemic, but they were not able to spend a lot of that money, and they accumulated it. Now they're spending it because inflation is outpacing wage gains, but once again, these rich individuals had a much bigger war chest to deal with than the average consumer out there, and that's why they've made so much money. In fact, a recent study showed that if the top 10 richest people in the world lost 99.999% of their wealth, they still have more money, the top 10 richest people, than 99% of the population out there. And that, of course, was a study by Oxfam out there. So it shows you the magnitude of the wealth that these individuals were able to accumulate and had even before the pandemic. And then during the pandemic, they were able to magnify that. A good example is Elon Musk, that at one point his wealth went up 1,000% relative to what he had before COVID. And I can tell you, Main Street America did not see their net wealth going up 1,000%.
Right, of course. Those are huge figures that you're talking about there. Josh Enomoto, great to have you with us on the show. Let's look at some figures here. There are a total of 704 billionaires in the United States compared to 614 at the beginning of the pandemic. They did not lose much during the pandemic. Now, if we look at taxing in the United States, the tax code has a huge loophole which enables the ultra-rich to pay little or no tax. And in some instances, if we look at people like Jeff Bezos, or as Anthony just pointed out to us, Elon Musk, they paid zero taxes. There was also a big loophole and a tax break put into the CARE Act. I mean, how does something like that slip into a COVID relief bill?
Well, let me first provide some context. So Oxfam International earlier this year reported that there would have been 3.4 million Black Americans that would have been alive today in the U.S. if black and white life expectancies were at parity. So when we talk about social inequities, we're not talking about an esoteric concept that doesn't have that we can't quantify. This is our problem. It's not just an issue that affects underprivileged communities. This is our problem. It will continue to exacerbate if we don't do anything about it. Now, to address the proposals to mitigate this circumstance, this crisis, really, we've seen Democrats, primarily Democrats and progressives, discuss about implementing a wealth tax, and that is meant to extract some of the wealth from these billionaires that have done so well during this crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, and redistribute it throughout the economy so that we all benefit. However, when you look at the details of these tax policies, it really comes down to taxing unrealized or unrecognized capital gains. And I'm not entirely sure if that is a practical approach because, number one, taxing unrealized or unrecognized capital gains is it's a slippery slope. It's very convoluted, and it adds complexities to an already complex tax structure in the U.S. So, and as well, the public will fear that the proposals that initially start off as narrowly focused towards addressing billionaire wealth will eventually come down to the middle class, because unfortunately the middle class does bear a significant brunt of the damage when it comes to tax liabilities.
Atiba, it's been a long time. I just want to follow up on what some of what Josh has been saying. I mean, we do have politicians who've been pushing for a wealth tax or a tax on billionaires and taxing the investment income of billionaires. Now, there's also talk of a 15% tax on companies. What will it take to get something like that passed?
It's going to take the public and public sentiment to push it. And unfortunately, we live within a capitalist system that too often is capitalizing on the addictions of the populace. So when we talk about Elon Musk, when we talk about Jeff Bezos, we talk about the pandemic, what we saw during the pandemic are people who were at home quarantining, trying to protect one another because the government was mandating we couldn't go outside, we couldn't do certain things. They were still spending money on Amazon. They were still apparently at some point buying Elon Musk's Teslas. And what we do know is that they had enough money to build rocket ships to go into outer space. What we do need, though, is a public sentiment that's going to push elected officials to better regulate. Right now, we see the war in Russia and with Russia and Ukraine that has taken up oil prices, though we don't see a decrease in production. Right now, what we continue to see is because of that is rising grocery prices, which is affecting the poor and the middle class. I'm right here in Miami, Florida, and every day I look out on the water and I see these billionaires with yachts and millionaires with big boats. And I often wonder and ask myself, as a descendant of slaves, how many slaves are there that it takes in order for them to be able to have those boats? And I say it from this standpoint. We're working really hard, and we're working harder in this country. We have this great resignation that we've seen where people are tired of the way that they're being forced to work longer hours, unable to spend as much time with their families, and being able to reimagine those things because of the pandemic. But what we also see is the government in the pockets of everyday Americans is that as hard as they're working, as soon as they make the money, most of the money is going out of their pocket because it's going back into the government. What we did also hear during the pandemic was a lot of people argue and say, well, they're just giving money back to people. They weren't giving people back money. They were giving them their own money back. So in order to change this, we have to change the whole fabric of the way that we think within this capitalist system, where it can benefit and still help those businesses to be able to produce and be able to create jobs. But too often we put too much emphasis on the stock market, and we see these very same companies, these billionaire companies, cut and shave in order to give more money to their stockholders, and not enough in terms of protecting the everyday workers. So that's why. So we've seen this transfer of wealth, but 100 years ago, we saw the same thing happen.
But when you say we've got to change public sentiment, Atiba, I mean, people can continue to shop at Amazon. They can continue, if they want to, they can afford it, buy Teslas from Elon Musk, and at the same time still demand that they pay their fair share of taxes.
Absolutely, which is where the regulation comes in, which is where the public sentiment comes in. The thinking in America is too often that if I work hard, I can become a millionaire. My child can go and play sports and become a celebrity. We have this whole celebrity idea that, I too can do it. So then the middle class and even the poor tend to want to protect those wealthy because they keep thinking that if I'm wealthy, I don't want them to tax me. So we have to change the public sentiment. And really, honestly, if you look at the minimum wage in this country, there are some people like Senator Warren and Bernie Sanders, who have
Yep.
talked often about raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. If you go back to 1968 to now, we talk about inflation, we talk about minimum wage, it should actually be $25 an hour. It's not. So when I say changing the public sentiment, the public has to, and the middle class have to think more so about how it's helping itself and stop
Right.
taking and looking at how it's protecting the wealthy.
Okay. Anthony, there was a report on CBS which quoted an economist from the Tax Foundation, who said a wealth tax, I'm quoting here, a wealth tax would have a negative impact on the economy. It would reduce national income, discourage savings, and encourage consumption, among other downsides. Do you agree?
Well, I personally, I'm not really greatly in favor of a wealth tax per se, but not because I don't want to have people pay their fair share. I do. I'm just worried that somehow these billionaires have good ways to be able to avoid that tax. So I would like to change the way we measure income. For example, many of these rich individuals, the reason why they don't pay a tax is because they have very low salaries, and so they get paid in stock. And then they take the stock and they use it as collateral and borrow money, and then they don't have much income. So if we change the laws and says you can't do that anymore, that if you are basically borrowing the money from your stock in order to finance your income to avoid taxes,
Right.
then you have to pay taxes that way, then I think you fix it. So all these tricks about taxing unrealized wealth and unrealized capital gains, I think it's a mirage. I think the thing to do is to shut down the loopholes that these billionaires have to make sure they pay their fair share, because it is no secret that you often see people in the middle class having a higher marginal tax rate than some of these individuals. That's not fair. That needs to end, but we need to close those loopholes.
Josh, I've only got a minute left. Very quickly, your response to what Anthony's just been talking about.
Yeah, I think what he's referring to in part is what I would term the velocity of compensation. So a lot of the wealth inequities that have occurred is because in terms of, for instance, capital gains, if you're talking about stocks and especially cryptos, if you see a massive paper gain, you can realize it right away. Whereas a lot of the working class, of course, their primary and only source of income is wages and salaries. That's the caboose of the financial structure, the spectrum. So we need to realize that there are also velocity discrepancies as well as the nominal discrepancies.
Okay, and we need to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.